Officer Blake prided himself on his reputation. In his small, he was both feared and revered. To some, he was a hero, keeping order by whatever means necessary. To others, especially the black community, he was a menace, a man who wielded his badge like a weapon and twisted the law to satisfy his prejudice. Blake had built a career on intimidation, false charges, and the unwavering support of a justice system that always seemed to side with him. He had perfected the art of targeting people he deemed as threats, and his actions had gone unchecked for years. It was a quiet, humid evening when the call came in. Suspicious activity at Parkside Gardens, the dispatcher reported. 2 individuals possibly loitering or plotting illegal activity. For Blake, it was an invitation he couldn't resist. The park was in one of the wealthiest areas of town, and a strict sense of exclusivity. Blake had patrolled this area before and rarely saw black visitors. To him, their presence alone was cause for suspicion. When Blake arrived, he parked his cruiser at the edge of the park, stepping out with his flashlight in hand. His eyes immediately locked on 2 women seated on a bench under the glow of a lamppost. Angela and Simone looked sharp and professional, but neatly dressed in casual outfit. Between them were a stack of papers, a laptop, and a tablet. They were deep in conversation, occasionally gesturing to the documents or typing into their devices. Blake's mind jumped to conclusions. 2 black women sitting in an upscale park, handling documents late in the evening. This couldn't be innocent. His face twisted into a smirk as he approached them. "Evening, ladies," he said, his tone laced with condescension. Angela looked up first, her expression calm but wary. "Good evening, officer," she replied politely. Simone followed, glancing at Blake before returning to her laptop, unbothered. "What are you doing here?" Blake demanded, skipping pleasantries. "This park closes to the public at dusk." Angela gestured to a nearby sign that clearly stated the park was open until 10 p.m. "We're well within the park's hours, officer. We're attorneys working on a legal case, and this was a quiet place to review our materials." Blake narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing them. Their explanation only heightened his suspicion. In his mind, it didn't add up. Why would 2 black women be lawyers? And why would they choose this park, of all places, to work? He ignored the sign Angela had pointed out and pressed further. "This park isn't for loitering or organizing protests," he said, his tone accusatory. "What's really going on here?" Simone finally looked up, her expression neutral but firm. "Officer, as my colleague mentioned, we're preparing for a case. There's nothing illegal happening here." Blake scoffed. "Don't play games with me. I know when someone's hiding something. Hand over those papers and let me see what you're up to." Angela calmly folded her hands over the stack of documents. "These are privileged legal materials, officer. You're not authorized to view them without a warrant." That was all Blake needed to hear. Their refusal to comply felt like a direct challenge to his authority. His temper flared. "Refusing to cooperate, are we? I've seen your type before," he sneered. "Coming here, acting like you're above the law." Angela and Simone exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. Simone gave the faintest nod, and Angela turned back to Blake, her voice steady. "Officer, we're not resisting. We're simply asserting our rights." Blake's face reddened. Rights? He didn't want to hear about their rights. In his eyes, these women were troublemakers. Whether they were lawyers or not didn't matter. He reached for his cuffs. "Enough of this. You're under arrest for trespassing and suspicious activity. Stand up." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line, but she rose without protest. Simone followed suit, carefully closing her laptop and setting it aside. As Blake roughly cuffed Angela's wrists, she looked over her shoulder at him and said quietly, "You're making a mistake." Blake let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, is that so? We'll see about that." He cuffed Simone next, his grip unnecessarily tight. She winced but said nothing, her expression unreadable. Blake radioed for backup to transport the women to the station. As they waited, Angela and Simone remained calm, standing silently by the bench. Blake watched them, growing more irritated by their composure. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" he muttered. Angela met his gaze, her expression steady. "I think you're underestimating us." Blake snorted. "We'll see how smart you feel when the judge gets involved." When the backup car arrived, Blake loaded the women in, feeling the surge of satisfaction. To him, this was another victory, another night proving his dominance. But as he glanced at Angela through the rearview mirror, he caught a hint of a smile on her face, subtle but deliberate. It sent a ripple of unease through him, though he quickly shook it off. What could these women possibly do? Hit the like button and share where you're watching from. He didn't realize the answer was waiting for him in court. The drive to the station was filled with Officer Blake's voice, sharp and arrogant, as he rattled on about his so-called heroic efforts to keep the town in order. "I've dealt with plenty of troublemakers like you," he sneered, glancing in the rearview mirror at Angela and Simone. "You think you can walk into places you don't belong, stir things up, and get away with it? Not on my watch." Angela sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm and unreadable. Simone, beside her, stared out the window, her face equally composed. Neither woman reacted to his taunts. The silence unsettled Blake, though he wouldn't admit it. He thrived on seeing fear in the eyes of those he arrested, but these two gave him nothing. "You know," he continued, trying to provoke a response, "it's people like you who think the rules don't apply. Always playing the victim, always causing chaos. But I've got news for you. This is my town, and I don't let chaos take root here." Still, the women said nothing. Angela's steady gaze in the mirror made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. He barked, "What? You got nothing to say now? Figured you'd be all fired up about how unfair life is." Angela finally spoke, her voice even and calm. "There's nothing to say. Actions speak louder than words." Her response made Blake clench his jaw. Something about her confidence felt off. Wrong, even. But he shoved the thought aside, chalking it up to arrogance. He was determined to show these women who was in charge. When they arrived at the station, Blake dragged Angela and Simone out of the car and marched them inside, drawing the attention of a few officers on duty. His colleagues had seen this routine before and exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Blake's reputation preceded him, and most of the department had learned to stay out of his way. As Blake booked the women, he fabricated a list of charges that grew more outlandish with each passing minute. Conspiracy to incite violence, trespassing, resisting arrest. He muttered as he typed into the system. His fingers flew over the keyboard, inventing details to bolster his claims. Angela and Simone stood quietly, their expressions unreadable. Angela's eyes scanned the room, noting the positions of cameras. Simone, meanwhile, observed Blake's actions closely, particularly when he slipped a folder into Angela's bag, a folder that neither of them had brought. Blake turned to them with a smug grin. "Well, look at that. Seems you two weren't just chatting in the park. I found evidence of your little plans to stir up some riots." He held up a piece of paper from the folder, waving it triumphantly. Simone raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Angela tilted her head slightly and remarked, "Interesting. I wonder where that came from." Blake ignored her comment, too busy congratulating himself on the airtight case he believed he'd built. "You two are going to learn the hard way. Judges here don't take kindly to people trying to start trouble. I'd get comfortable in that cell if I were you." As he led them toward the holding area, Angela paused and turned to him. Her tone was steady, but her words carried an edge that made Blake's stomach flip. "You're digging a hole you can't climb out of, Officer Blake. I hope you're ready for what's coming." Blake laughed dismissively, though the faint unease crept back into his mind. "Nice try," he said, pushing her forward. "You're not scaring me." In the holding cell, Angela and Simone sat quietly, their calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos Blake was creating behind the scenes. He spent the next hour manipulating their arrest report, embellishing details to make them appear dangerous and uncooperative. He even doctored surveillance footage from the park, splicing together unrelated clips to create the illusion of a crime. Other officers occasionally glanced at him, their discomfort evident. A younger officer, fresh on the force, hesitated as he passed Blake's desk. Sir, are you sure about all this? I mean, it doesn't seem like they were." Blake cut him off with a glare. "You questioning me, rookie? I know what I'm doing." The rookie nodded quickly and walked away, leaving Blake to continue his work. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Blake didn't realize that Angela and Simone's calm wasn't resignation. It was strategy. In the cell, Angela leaned back against the wall, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. Simone glanced at her watch, then at Angela. "Almost time," she said softly, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Angela nodded. "Let him dig deeper. It'll make the fall that much harder." The courtroom was filled to capacity the next morning, buzzing with anticipation. Officer Blake, known for his charisma and boldness, strode in with confidence, nodding to the judge. He glanced at Angela and Simone, seated calmly at the defense table, their poise unsettling. Blake's chest swelled with pride as he adjusted his badge and took the stand. His story was polished, practiced, and full of drama. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I stand here today as an officer who takes my duty to this town seriously. On the night in question, I acted swiftly to prevent what could have been a catastrophic event. These two individuals," he pointed at Angela and Simone, "were conspiring to incite violence, threatening the safety of our community. It was my job to stop them." Blake spun a gripping tale of heroism, painting Angela and Simone as dangerous agitators. He claimed they were plotting large-scale protests that he had reason to believe would turn violent. As he spoke, the judge, known for favoring law enforcement, nodded along, his expression stern. The spectators whispered among themselves, some convinced by Blake's dramatic performance. Blake's confidence grew with every word. "I confiscated evidence from their belongings, documents outlining plans to disrupt public order. I did my duty to protect this town from chaos." He leaned back, casting a triumphant glance at Angela and Simone. The room felt charged, the tide seemingly in his favor. When Blake finished, the judge turned to the women. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Angela rose gracefully, adjusting her blazer. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority that made the room fall silent. "Your Honor, my name is Angela Carter. I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Blake's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Angela continued, unbothered. "I have spent years investigating systemic corruption within law enforcement, including fabricated charges, planted evidence, and abuses of power. What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern." Simone stood next, her tone sharp and clear. "And I am Simone Hayes, a senior investigator for the Department of Justice. Officer Blake's actions last night were not only unethical but illegal. He didn't just arrest two innocent women. He walked straight into an undercover operation designed to expose his misconduct." Blake froze, his expression twisting into disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he blurted out, his voice cracking. Angela calmly retrieved a folder from her briefcase. "Let me show you." She handed the judge a series of documents, including surveillance footage, audio recordings, and transcripts of Blake's statements. The recordings revealed Blake's racist remarks during the arrest, his fabrication of charges, and the planting of evidence. Simone followed with additional records, complaints from citizens Blake had wrongfully arrested over the years, each swept under the rug by the department. The courtroom was silent as the evidence mounted. Every piece was damning, exposing Blake not as a hero, but as a corrupt officer who had built his career on lies and abuse. But the final blow came when Simone revealed the ultimate twist. "Your Honor, the anonymous tip that led Officer Blake to the park last night, that was from our team." She turned to Blake, her voice cutting. "We orchestrated the entire scenario to catch you in the act." Gasps rippled through the room. Blake's face drained of color. He stammered, "You set me up." Angela's expression didn't waver. "We gave you the chance to act lawfully, to approach with professionalism and respect. Instead, you did exactly what we anticipated. You abused your power, fabricated evidence, and violated our rights. And now, the world knows." The judge leaned forward, his face dark with anger. "Officer Blake, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Blake sat frozen, unable to respond. His confidence was shattered, replaced by the weight of undeniable truth. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief and outrage, the spectators now seeing him for what he truly was. Angela turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we recommend that Officer Blake be immediately removed from duty and that his actions be investigated further. This isn't just about us. It's about every person he's wronged." The judge nodded grimly. "This court will recess to deliberate on the charges." As Angela and Simone sat down, the courtroom erupted into a mixture of applause and shocked whispers. For Blake, the walls were closing in. And for the town, the truth was finally exposed. As the courtroom settled into silence, the weight of the evidence against Officer Blake became impossible to ignore. The smug confidence he had carried since the beginning of the trial had evaporated, replaced by panic. His hands trembled as he fumbled for words. This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking. "They're twisting the facts." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Enough," he bellowed, his face red with anger. "Officer Blake, the evidence against you is overwhelming. You have not only failed in your duty as an officer of the law, but have betrayed the very justice you swore to uphold." Blake opened his mouth to protest, but the judge cut him off. "Silence. Your actions are not only reprehensible but criminal. This court will not tolerate such abuse of power." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Blake sank into his chair, his face pale, and his composure shattered. The once confident officer now looked like a broken man, trapped by his own lies. Angela rose, her presence commanding. She walked to the front of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the spectators. "Your Honor, what we witnessed here today is not just the failure of one man, but the consequence of a system that has allowed prejudice and corruption to flourish unchecked." She paused, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Blake saw us as a threat not because of what we were doing, but because of who we are. Two black women in a park, simply existing, became his justification for fabricating lies, planting evidence, and attempting to destroy our lives. This isn't about one arrest. It's about countless others who have been silenced, dismissed, or ignored." Her words resonated deeply, drawing a hush over the courtroom. Spectators who had once doubted Angela and Simone now looked on with respect, their expressions filled with shame and admiration. "Today," Angela continued, her voice rising, "his lies end, and justice begins, not just for us, but for everyone who has been wronged." Simone stepped forward, her gaze locked on Blake. "Corruption doesn't just harm individuals, it destroys trust in the entire system. That's why we came here. Not for revenge, but to bring accountability to those who think they are untouchable." The judge nodded solemnly. "Officer Blake, you are hereby stripped of your badge. A full investigation into your conduct and the department's practices will begin immediately. This court will ensure that justice is served." As Blake was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Simone leaned in close to him and whispered, "You weren't just wrong. You were the case." Blake's face twisted in confusion and fear, the realization of their plan dawning on him. He had been the target all along, and his arrogance had played right into their hands. The courtroom erupted in applause as Angela and Simone gathered their things. Outside, a crowd had gathered, news of the trial spreading rapidly. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the townspeople cheered for the women who had stood against injustice. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Angela glanced at Simone and smiled. He never saw it coming. Simone smirked. They never do. The two women paused for a moment, taking in the applause before walking away, their work far from finished. They had won this battle, but they knew there were countless others to fight. Together, they were ready to tackle the next injustice, armed with truth, courage, and an unwavering determination to hold the powerful accountable. The town, shaken to its core, began to demand change. Angela and Simone's operation became a national story, sparking widespread calls for reform. New policies were implemented, and corrupt officers were rooted out. The ripple effect of their courage brought hope to those who had felt powerless for far too long. Angela and Simone didn't stop there. They had exposed a system, but they were determined to change it. With every step, they carried the voices of the silenced, proving that justice, when fought for, could prevail.